Assalamu alaikum. I'm Carl Arrindell and you're watching In Focus. Now, just over a week ago, the long-awaited Chilcott report into the Iraq war was finally published. 7 years and millions of pounds after the inquiry was first opened in 2009. I'm joined by Lyndsey, one of the founding members and the convener of the British anti-war organisation Stop the War Coalition and a staunch critic of Tony Blair. She was formerly a member of the Socialist Workers' Party, sitting on its Central Committee and editor of its magazine Socialist Review, from which she resigned in February 2010 after 37 years of membership due to, and I quote, increasing disenchantment with the leadership. She's an author, having written several books, including 2 on women's rights, and co-authored A People's History of London. Lyndsey twice stood as a left-wing candidate for Mayor of London, coming 5th in 2004, and as the left-list mayoral candidate in 2008 and May elections, she's been a prominent voice in backing Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party. Assalamu alaikum, and Lyndsey and welcome to In Focus.
Thank you very much.
Now, you were one of the key people involved in setting up the Stop the War Coalition in September 2001 to oppose the war in Afghanistan and in Iraq. You later became the convener of the Stop the War Coalition. Back in 2003, on the eve of war in Iraq, and according to BBC News, between 6 and 11 million people took part in protests in up to 60 countries over the weekend of February the 15th and the 16th. A new record, I think, in protest. The numbers that marched in London were estimated to be in the region of 2 million, depending on whose statistics you are looking at. Yet we still went to war. I'd like if you could perhaps explain to me what the mood was at that time when so much protest had been expressed against the war, yet we still went to it, yet the government seemed to totally ignore the will of the people. How did that impact?
Well, I think that it's worth remembering about those protests, that they were protests before a war began, which of course is unusual for anti-war movements. They normally take place, if you look historically, when a war has already long been in process and where it's becoming more and more unpopular. But this time, people felt they could really make a difference to stopping a war before it started. We'd already had the experience of Afghanistan. People didn't want another war. And I think it was really one where people believed their presence in London or in Rome or wherever it was that they demonstrated would really make a material difference. So there was an electric atmosphere. And we estimated 2 million. The police put it at more than 1 million. But we based ours on 2 things. One, an opinion poll, which showed that at least 1 person from every 23 households in Britain had demonstrated that weekend, and an urban geographer who calculated it at well over 2 million. But it's impossible to know exactly how many. But again, when you look worldwide, huge demonstrations in Spain, huge demonstrations in Italy, very big demonstrations everywhere else across America and Europe. So there was a feeling, a real feeling, that the politicians couldn't ignore the will of the people. And in fact, the New York Times described the 2 superpowers, the US on the one hand and mass public opinion mobilised on the other. So it was. So that was the feeling.
That
really.
feeling of euphoria and empowerment was suddenly slashed. We went to war. How did that impact on political activity, political movements? Some say that the left went to sleep after that.
Well, what happens is there are different ways that people respond to it. We still managed to get very large numbers of people out on the streets during the war and when Bush came to London a few months later. But of course, lots of people do say, we protested, it didn't work, they went to war. And so it does have a longer-term impact. It has an impact in terms of whether people think they can protest or not, whether it's worth protesting. It also has an impact, and I think we see this very, very much today in Britain, has an impact on people's view of politicians, because what they felt was, what more could we have done to say to the politicians that they were wrong and we were right? What more could we have done? And the truth is there were more things, but by and large that's correct, that people did what they could and made lots and lots of personal sacrifices to protest in all sorts of ways. The fact that Blair took no notice of them, I think, is one reason today that there is so much cynicism about politicians, and so why people don't trust politicians in the way that they did perhaps 15 years ago or when Blair first came into office.
Now, last week, after a decade almost, we finally saw the publication of the Chilcott report. Now, even some of Blair's strongest critics including the former Telegraph's chief political correspondent Peter Oborne, felt that, and I quote, Sir John Chilcott, the chairman of the inquiry examining the UK's role in the Iraq War, has done his job. He said that the report was not a letdown, that it left former Prime Minister Tony Blair without a leg to stand on and is pregnant with significance. He said he has fundamentally gone to the heart of the matter. He's shown that Mr Blair's government took Britain into an unnecessary war. Now, before we go on to the implications of Tony Blair and his culpability, what is it fair to state a statement to say that Chilcott was really done a reasonable job?
Well, I think up to a point it is, because I think most people did not expect him to be as harsh as he was on Blair, and there was absolutely no doubt in the minds of anybody who heard Chilcott on that day that this was a very, very severe indictment of Blair. But of course, part of the problem is then you have this question of interpretation, because there's no legal outcome to Chilcott. There's no way that Chilcott can get up and say this man should be tried. There's no way that he can get up and say anything can happen as a result of my report. It's just a report. So it's very interesting. The next day, I think all of the print media in this country were extremely critical. If you look at the headlines, they were all very critical of Blair. What happens a week later? We have a debate in Parliament which is very different indeed, and it consists of a number of MPs who get up and say the war was wrong, we should never have done it, but also very large numbers of MPs who, in my view, quite shamefully said it doesn't blame Blair for anything, which is, by the way, a wrong interpretation of the report. But also it says we all acted in good faith. Well, I think we expect a bit more from politicians, that they just follow blindly in supposed good faith. They're expected to use their judgment, and it's clear they didn't. So I think they're rowing back, really, from the Chilcott conclusions.
Now, Stop the War issued a statement which said the publication of Chilcott last week left most people in no doubt that it was a severe indictment of Tony Blair and those around him, and further that it was a major indictment of the whole political system of the establishment in Britain. Parliament, MI6, cabinet, government, democratic accountability, the civil service, legal advice. One could add, it said, perhaps the media, especially the BBC. Can you explain why it was an indictment of the whole political system and not just Tony Blair?
Well, I think it was obviously something which happened, if you like, despite the supposed checks and balances which exist in British political life. I mean, when I studied British Constitution, it was always, you know, the idea of the separation of powers, the idea that politicians couldn't just do that what they wanted. There would be legal checks on them, there would be civil service checks on them. This really went out of the window with Tony Blair's government, because it's clear he didn't relate to the cabinet at all on the question of the war. They just were there to rubber stamp things. He ignored his legal advice, which would have been a very important check on what he did. MI6 was clearly used in a way of bringing across all sorts of evidence which was slanted in a particular way. You know, it's not necessarily that the intelligence, you know, the Blair's supporters are now saying, well, it's not true that the intelligence was wrong, but there were things omitted about the intelligence. There were things slanted in a particular way. There were things where the caveats which the intelligence services put on certain pieces of information were just discarded and not mentioned by the politicians. That seems to me that involves quite a high level of co-opting the various elements of the British establishment, and I think extends to the mainstream media, including, or perhaps especially, to the BBC, which I think has become much, much closer to, as an arm of government almost, in the way that it puts these things across.
So what was that about? Do you think that the establishment was too hungry for war, regardless? They were joining Blair in this sort of vaingloriousness? I
think it's worse than that in a way, because if that were the case, then you might think there was a sort of collective madness that gripped people. But I think what it is, you have a Prime Minister determined to do things, links up with the American president, and we know from the letters which are revealing, you know, the sort of the teenage kind of thing, I will be with you, whatever. You know, the whole kind of way that sort of power operates and does operate, and the fact is the military, both from the US and Britain, were already involved in preparing for war and shipping troops to Kuwait before before the vote in Parliament was ever taken. So I think it becomes a kind of almost a fait accompli. There's nobody standing up to Blair and government, or very few people, and Robin Cook obviously did resign, and he was an important figure. But Parliament was really traduced. It's
caught up in the hysteria.
It's well known that for several days before the vote, Tony Blair, Cherie Blair, all their allies were sitting in Parliament, calling MPs in one by one, saying to them all sorts of things, to either promise them things or to threaten them or whatever it was that they were doing in order to get them to vote like that. So I think it was a whole process. And the British establishment, if you like, comes out of it very, very badly.
Now, to stop the war, I've gone further to say that, look, the report, the major conclusions of the report were flawed. Firstly, it says, and I'm quoting, the report finds that there was no falsification or misuse of intelligence by Tony Blair at number 10. Secondly, it says it finds that there was no attempt to deceive cabinet ministers. That's fundamental. And third, it finds that there was no secret pact with the US to go to war. I mean, you just mentioned a quote in a moment that seems to contradict that. That means that there is no justification for saying that evidence was confected or that there was a case for war was a deception. Does that mean that despite the report leaving people in no doubt of the indictment against Blair, there is no longer any prospect of Blair facing a trial in the International Criminal Court?
Well, I think, firstly, that interpretation of it is a misleading interpretation, because it's true that Chilcott didn't say that Blair lied, and I don't think any of us ever expected him to put it in those words. But it's made absolutely clear at various points that, if you like, selective intelligence briefings, not telling people things in a way that it seems like you have evidence but you don't, as when just before the war, as when they said that Saddam had been in a material breach of the conditions of the weapons inspections. All those, I think, do point to deceit. And one very interesting example is that when they originally planned the first dossier about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, it was originally going to cover 4 countries, which was Iran, Iraq, North Korea and Libya. Then, as evidence accumulated, it was clear that there were at least as much, if not more, evidence against some of the other countries as there was against Iraq. So it suddenly gets narrowed down by Jack Straw to just Iraq. So people can't make the comparison. Should we invade this country, or perhaps we should invade another country, or perhaps we shouldn't invade any of them. None of that is
being the
yes,
key
regime change was the key thing, which of course was the American aim quite openly, but was illegal for Britain, which is why Blair went through this whole charade, really, of saying that he was going to go to the UN and wanted to get a second resolution and so on, because he needed that.
Well, I remember sitting actually in the studio talking to Sir Jeremy Greenstock not long after the war had begun, and he answered a question from me. I said, look, you sound a bit like Donald Rumsfeld when you talked about the known unknowns, when you keep referring to the war being legal but not legitimate. I said, what exactly is it that you're saying? And he sort of said that America had a mandate to go to war from the first war. They didn't need any permissions, and that Sir Jeremy was winding them up by continually going around trying to obtain some legitimacy of getting a consensus, and that they kept telling him to stop doing it.
No, the Americans did. You see, Blair's defence now is, I was really trying to get to the Americans to come to the UN because I was worried they'd go off and do things on their own anyway. Well, you could look at this another way, which is that by going through this whole pretence about going to the UN, all you did was give cover to a president who was intending to do this anyway. And I think a lot of the people most closely involved, not Blair, I don't think, but lots of the people around him, must have realised by the time war was imminent that this wasn't going to go well. But then, of course, how do you retreat from this kind of thing when you've got tens of thousands of troops in the Middle East already, where everybody is going ahead, where Bush is determined to go ahead? So Britain ended up going ahead as well, with disastrous consequences.
But was it correct for Jeremy Corbyn to make an apology that day on behalf of the Labour Party? Does that mark, as far as you know, an end to it? stop the war and all those who waited?
Well, I think it was very good that we got an apology from Jeremy Corbyn, and I'm actually quite shocked at how many Labour MPs are still defending the war. I think the very least they can do is either be quiet about it if that's what they really believe, and we don't want them to lie if that is what they believe, or perhaps look at the range of evidence and realise that they were wrong. So I think it was very important Jeremy did that. I think it was one main reason that he got elected last year was to do with his anti-war record and his promise in the campaign that he would apologise over Iraq. And I think that I don't think it's drawn the line, because if you look now, some MPs are trying to get a motion of censure on Blair in Parliament for being in contempt of Parliament, is the wording that I think they're trying to find, and I hope that that does succeed.
So do you believe that there are some legal grounds for reviewing his abuse of government powers? I know your statement read, and you just made reference to it, that it's clear that the intelligence was falsified or misused by missing out on the many caveats on intelligence service suppositions, by claiming that there was evidence when there was not, as is Blair's claim that Saddam was in material breach of conditions over WMD just before the war began, and importantly the revelation that he made in his pledge to Bush, that he said, "I'll be with you whatever." While he was still pretending to the rest of the world that there's no such agreement had been made.
And a very important thing that